What if I told you that the deepest shift you will ever experience in this life does not announce itself with thunder or revelation, but arrives in the quietest hours, when you stop reaching, stop defending, stop trying to convince anyone, including yourself, that you are enough? It comes not as an event, but as a settling, a kind of inner exhale that has no witness and no applause. You might be standing in your kitchen, hands wet from washing dishes, light slanting through the window in that particular way it does in late afternoon, and something inside you simply stops fighting. There is no drama, no insight that can be named, just a subtle rearrangement of weight, as though something you have been carrying without knowing has quietly set itself down. Most people spend their entire lives in a state of inner negotiation. They are constantly translating themselves for others, adjusting tone, posture, story. They enter rooms and immediately begin measuring, scanning faces for approval or threat. They speak and then replay their words in the silent theater of the mind, wondering if they sounded foolish, if they were too much or not enough. This is not weakness. This is not failure. This is the condition of being human in a world that taught you, long before you had language for it, that love is conditional and presence must be earned. But there comes a time, often without announcement, when this entire mechanism begins to lose its grip, not because you have defeated it, not because you have become enlightened or healed or finally good enough, but because you have grown tired. Not the tiredness of despair, but the tiredness that comes from carrying a weight that was never yours to carry in the first place. You begin to notice, in small moments, that you're no longer performing. You're no longer rehearsing. You say something in conversation, and you do not afterward pick it apart. You make a choice, and you do not spend the next 3 days justifying it to the tribunal of your own mind. Something has shifted, and the shift is so subtle that you might not even name it for months. This is not a coincidence. Nothing in the psyche is a coincidence. Every symptom, every compulsion, every repeating dream or recurring argument is the soul's way of speaking in the only language it has. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He saw that the unconscious does not communicate in clear sentences or rational arguments. It communicates in images, in patterns, in the things we do without knowing why. He called this synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence, the moment when inner and outer reality reflect one another in a way that cannot be explained by chance. But synchronicity is not magic. It is recognition. It is the moment when you finally see that what you have been living through is never random, that every detour and delay and dark season was preparing you for something you could not have understood before. And what it was preparing you for, more than anything, is this, the moment when you no longer need to prove anything. Not your worth, not your intelligence, not your goodness, not even your healing. The moment when the entire project of self-justification falls away, and what remains is not emptiness but presence, a kind of quiet authority that does not need to announce itself because it is not performing for an audience. It simply is. Jung spoke often of the persona, the mask we wear in the world, and the self, the deeper center of our being that exists beneath all roles and identities. For most of our lives, we live almost entirely in the persona. We are the good child, the reliable friend, the competent professional, the one who holds it together. And these roles are not false. They are real, but they are not the whole truth. Beneath them is something older, something that does not change with circumstances, something that was there before you learned to speak and will be there when all the roles fall away. Jung called this the self, and he said that the work of a lifetime is to bring the ego, the conscious sense of I, into right relationship with this deeper center. Not to dissolve the ego, not to transcend it, but to let it serve something larger than its own survival. And this process, this slow turning inward, this gradual release of the need to be seen and validated and understood, this is what returns us to balance. not the balance of equal parts, not the balance of fairness or justice, but the balance of a tree that has deep roots and does not need to explain why it grows the way it does. The balance of a river that does not ask permission to flow. The balance of a life that has stopped arguing with itself. In this video, I will share with you 7 inner shifts, 7 quiet signs that indicate this process is already happening inside you. These are not achievements. They are not milestones you reach through effort or discipline. They are recognitions. They are moments when you notice that something has changed, not because you made it change, but because the soul has been working in the background all along, slowly rearranging the furniture of your inner life. You may not have named these shifts yet. You may have dismissed them as nothing, as small things, as irrelevant. But I would invite you to consider that these small things are not small at all. That they are, in fact, the most important things. That they're the evidence of a transformation that does not need to be loud to be real. If you stay with me until the end, you may find yourself reinterpreting moments from the past weeks or months. You may realize that what felt like withdrawal was actually consolidation. That what felt like silence was actually listening. That what felt like loss was actually the clearing of space for something that could not arrive while you were still clinging to what no longer served you. There is no rush. We will move slowly. We will return to the same idea from different angles, because this is how the psyche works. Not in straight lines, but in spirals, circling the same center again and again, each time from a deeper place. The first sign is this: you stop explaining yourself. Not because you have become cold or indifferent, not because you no longer care what others think, but because the compulsion to justify your choices, your feelings, your existence has simply faded. You notice it first in small ways. Someone asks why you made a particular decision, and instead of launching into a detailed defense, you say something simple. I just felt it was right, or I needed to, and then you stop talking. There is no anxiety in the silence that follows. No rush to fill the space with more words, more reasons, more proof. You have said what is true, and that is enough. This is not something you practice. This is not a technique. It arises naturally when the inner judge, the one who has been cross-examining you for years, begins to lose interest. That judge was installed long ago, usually in childhood, when you learned that love and safety were contingent on being a certain way. You learned that if you could explain yourself well enough, if you could make a good enough case, you might be allowed to exist without punishment. And so you became very good at building arguments, at anticipating objections, at defending your right to feel what you feel and want what you want. But this is exhausting. And at some point, without deciding to, you simply stop doing it. You might be talking to a friend, and they say something that in the past would have triggered a long explanation, a need to correct a misunderstanding, a need to make sure they see you accurately. But now you just let pass. Not because you're suppressing your truth, but because you realize that their misunderstanding does not actually threaten you. It does not change what is real. You are no longer trying to control how you are perceived, because you have begun to trust that who you are does not depend on whether others see it clearly. This can be disorienting at first. You might feel like you're being passive, like you're letting people get away with misreading you. But if you sit with it, you will notice something deeper. You will notice that the need to be understood was actually a need to be safe. It was a survival mechanism. And now, for reasons you cannot fully articulate, you feel safer inside yourself than you ever have before. Not because your circumstances have improved, not because people have suddenly become more trustworthy, but because the ground beneath you has solidified. You are no longer standing on the approval of others. You're standing on something older and deeper, something that was always there, but that you could not feel while you were so busy performing. Jung would say that this is the beginning of individuation, the process by which the ego stops identifying entirely with the persona and begins to sense the presence of the self. The self does not need to explain itself. It does not need to be validated. It simply is. And as you begin to touch that place, even briefly, the compulsion to justify your existence begins to fall away. You stop arguing with people who do not want to understand. You stop trying to convince those who have already decided who you are. You let them be wrong, and you discover that their wrongness does not diminish you. There's a kind of loneliness in this at first, because you realize that many of your relationships were built on a foundation of explanation, of constantly translating yourself so that others could tolerate your presence. And when you stop doing that, some people drift away, not because they are bad people, but because they do not know how to relate to you when you're not performing. They mistake your stillness for coldness. They mistake your lack of defensiveness for indifference. And you cannot explain this to them, because the very act of explaining would be a return to the old pattern. So you let them go, and you trust that the ones who are meant to remain will find their way to you in this new configuration. This is not easy, but is necessary, because you cannot become whole while still fragmenting yourself for the comfort of others. You cannot find balance while still pouring your energy into the endless task of being understood. At some point, you have to choose yourself, not in a selfish way, but in a way that honors the truth of your being. And when you do, when you stop explaining, you will notice that the people who remain are the ones who never needed the explanation in the first place. They are the ones who see you, not because you convinced them, but because they are willing to look. The second sign is this: you become comfortable with not knowing. For most of your life, you have been taught that clarity is the goal, that you should always know what you want, where you're going, what you believe. You have been taught that uncertainty is a problem to be solved, a gap to be filled with information or decision or action. And so you have spent years trying to figure it all out, trying to have the right answers, trying to be sure. But now, something has changed. You find yourself in situations where you do not know what to think, what to feel, what to do, and instead of panicking, instead of rushing to resolve the ambiguity, you simply sit with it. You let it be. This is not apathy. This is not avoidance. This is a deep trust in the process of unfolding. You have begun to understand, not intellectually, but in your body, that not all questions are meant to be answered right away, that some things need time to reveal themselves, that the soul has its own timing, and it does not conform to the demands of the conscious mind. You have stopped forcing clarity, and in that stopping, a different kind of knowing begins to emerge. Not the knowing of certainty, but the knowing of rightness, the sense that even though you cannot see the whole path, the next step is clear enough. This shift often comes after a period of great confusion, a time when you tried everything to figure out what to do and nothing worked. You made lists, you sought advice, you analyzed and planned and strategized, and still the answer did not come. And then, exhausted, you gave up, not in despair, but in surrender. You stopped trying to force the river to flow faster, and you let yourself be carried. And in that letting go, something inside you relaxed. You realized that you do not have to have it all figured out. You realized that life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Jung spoke of this as the tension of opposites, the ability to hold two contradictory truths at the same time without collapsing into one or the other. He said that the psyche grows not through resolution, but through the capacity to endure paradox, to sit in the space between knowing and not knowing, between wanting and releasing, between self and other. This is where transformation happens, not in the clear light of certainty, but in the fertile darkness of uncertainty, where new forms can take shape without being prematurely defined. You begin to notice this in your daily life. Someone asks you a question, and instead of immediately offering an answer, you say, "I'm not sure yet," or "I'm still thinking about it." And you do not feel ashamed. You do not feel like you're failing by not having an immediate response. You trust that the answer will come when it is ready. And until then, you are content to live in the question. This is a radical shift in a culture that values speed and decisiveness above all else. It is a quiet rebellion against the idea that you must always be certain, always be ready, always have it together. And what you discover as you practice this is that not knowing is not a weakness. It is a kind of openness. It is the space where new information can enter, where intuition can speak, where the unconscious can offer its guidance without being drowned out by the noise of the rational mind. You become more receptive. You notice things you would have missed before, small signs, subtle shifts, the way a conversation changes tone, the way your body responds to a particular person or place. You're no longer so busy trying to control the outcome that you miss the process. This does not mean you become passive. It does not mean you stop making decisions or taking action. It means you stop forcing. You stop trying to make things happen through sheer will. You begin to sense when to move and when to wait, when to speak and when to be silent. You develop a kind of inner rhythm, a sense of timing that is not based on external deadlines or social expectations, but on the organic unfolding of your own life. And this rhythm brings balance, because you're no longer constantly pushing against yourself, no longer constantly at war with the pace of your own becoming. There's a particular kind of peace that comes with this. It is not the peace of having everything figured out. It is the peace of trusting that you do not need to. It is the peace of knowing that you are held by something larger than your own understanding, that the universe is not indifferent to your existence, that there is a pattern at work even when you cannot see it. Jung called this the self, the deeper intelligence that guides the process of individuation. Others might call it God, or the Tao, or simply life. The name does not matter. What matters is the trust, the willingness to not know, and in that not knowing, to remain open. The third sign is this: you stop seeking validation from the outside. This is different from not caring what others think. You still care. You are still human, but the center of gravity has shifted. You no longer need others to confirm that you're on the right path, that you are making good choices, that you are worthy of love and respect. You have begun to find that confirmation inside yourself, in the quiet knowing that arises when you are alone, when there is no one to perform for, when you are simply present with your own experience. This shift is subtle. It does not happen all at once. You might notice it first in the way you respond to compliments. Someone praises you, and instead of lighting up, instead of feeling a rush of relief or validation, you simply say thank you and let it pass. The compliment does not fill a hole inside you because the hole is no longer there, or at least it is smaller, less urgent. You are no longer walking around with a cup held out, hoping others will pour something into it. You have begun to fill your own cup, not through affirmations or self-help techniques, but through the simple act of being present with yourself, of listening to your own voice, of trusting your own experience. This can be confusing for the people around you. They are used to you seeking their approval, their reassurance, their opinion. And when you stop doing that, they might feel unsettled. They might accuse you of being distant, of not caring, of changing. And they are right. You have changed, but not in the way they think. You have not become cold or arrogant. You have become more yourself. You have stopped outsourcing your sense of worth to others. And in doing so, you have reclaimed a part of yourself that was always there, but that you could not access while you were so busy looking outside for what could only be found within. Jung understood this deeply. He said that the persona, the mask we wear in the world, is necessary for social functioning, but it becomes a prison when we identify with it completely, when we believe that we are only what others see. The work of individuation is to differentiate the ego from the persona, to realize that you are not your roles, not your achievements, not your reputation. You are something deeper, something that exists independent of external validation. And as you begin to touch that deeper place, the need for approval begins to fall away. Not because you have transcended it, but because you have found a more reliable source of confirmation within. This does not mean you become isolated or self-sufficient in a way that cuts you off from others. It means you come to relationships from a place of fullness rather than lack. You no longer need others to complete you, to tell you who you are, to give you permission to exist. You can receive their love, their feedback, their presence, without depending on it for your sense of self. And this changes the quality of your relationships. They become more honest, more spacious, more real. Because you're no longer performing, no longer managing impressions, no longer trying to be what you think others need you to be. You are just yourself, and that is enough. You begin to notice this in the way you make decisions. In the past, you might have consulted everyone, gathered opinions, tried to build consensus before moving forward. And there is nothing wrong with seeking input. But now, you notice that you consult yourself first. You sit with a question, you feel into it, you notice what arises in your body, in your intuition, in the quiet space before thought. And then, if it feels right, you might ask others what they think. But their answers do not override your own knowing. You take in their perspectives, you consider them, and then you return to yourself. You make the choice that feels true, even if it does not make sense to anyone else, even if it cannot be easily explained. This is a profound shift. It is the shift from external authority to internal authority. And it does not happen because you decide to be more confident or more independent. It happens because you have spent enough time with yourself, in silence and solitude, in the raw, unedited presence of your own being, that you have begun to trust what you find there. You have begun to trust that you have your own wisdom, your own guidance, your own sense of what is right for you. And this trust is not arrogance. It is humility. It is the recognition that no one else can live your life for you, that no one else has access to the full complexity of your inner world, that only you can know what is true for you in any given moment. And as this trust deepens, the need for external validation fades. You stop checking social media to see how many people like your post. You stop replaying conversations to see if you said the right thing. You stop asking others if you're doing okay. You know if you're doing okay. You can feel it. And when you're not okay, you do not need others to tell you that either. You sit with the not okayness. You let it move through you. You trust that it is part of the process. You stop needing to be fixed or saved or reassured. You become your own witness, your own companion, your own source of steady presence. This is what Jung meant by the self, not the ego, which is small and defensive and always trying to prove itself, but the self, which is vast and calm and does not need to prove anything. The self simply is. And as you begin to align with that deeper center, the entire project of seeking validation from the outside begins to feel irrelevant. Not because you no longer care about connection, but because you realize that true connection can only happen when you are not performing, when you're not trying to earn love, when you're simply present, as you are, without apology or explanation. The fourth sign is this. You begin to feel a deep, almost inexplicable peace in solitude. Not the peace of escape, not the peace of avoiding people or responsibilities, but the peace of coming home to yourself. You notice that when you are alone, you do not feel lonely. You do not feel the need to fill the silence with noise, with distractions, with the voices of others. You can simply sit and be, and that is enough. There is a fullness in the aloneness, a sense that you are not isolated but deeply connected to something larger, something that does not require another person to mediate it. This is not something you can force. You cannot decide to enjoy solitude and then suddenly feel at peace. It arises naturally when the inner noise begins to quiet, when the constant chatter of self-judgment and self-doubt and self-promotion begins to fade. When you're no longer at war with yourself, solitude stops feeling like exile and starts feeling like sanctuary. You begin to crave it, not because you're withdrawing from the world, but because you need time to integrate, to process, to simply be without the constant input of others. You might notice this after a busy day, when you finally close the door to your room and the silence settles around you like a blanket. In the past, this silence might have felt oppressive, might have triggered anxiety or restlessness, but now you exhale into it. You feel your body relax. You feel the tension in your shoulders release. You realize that you have been holding yourself in a particular way all day, a way that is not quite natural, and now, alone, you can let that go. You can be formless, undefined, unwitnessed, and there is a profound relief in that. Jung spoke of the necessity of solitude for individuation. He said that we cannot know ourselves while we are constantly reflected in the eyes of others, constantly adjusting to their expectations and projections. We need time alone, time in the dark, time in the silence, to hear our own voice, to feel our own presence, to encounter the parts of ourselves that do not fit into any social role. This is not selfish. This is essential, because if you do not know yourself, if you do not spend time with yourself, you will spend your entire life performing a version of yourself that was designed to please others, and you will never know what it feels like to simply be. You begin to protect this solitude. You say no to invitations that do not feel aligned. You create space in your schedule for nothing, for empty time, for time that is not productive or purposeful, but simply open. And this feels radical in a culture that glorifies busyness, that treats solitude as a problem to be solved, that assumes that if you are alone, you must be lonely. But you know differently now. You know that solitude is not loneliness. Loneliness is the ache of disconnection, the feeling that you are separate from life, from love, from meaning. Solitude is the opposite. It is the experience of being deeply connected, not to any one person, but to the whole of existence, to the quiet hum of being that runs beneath all the noise. In these moments of solitude, you begin to notice things. You notice the quality of light at different times of day. You notice the sound of your own breathing. You notice the thoughts that arise and pass, the emotions that move through you like weather. You become a witness to your own inner life, and in that witnessing, something shifts. You are no longer so identified with the content of your thoughts and feelings. You begin to see them as events, as movements, as patterns, rather than as the totality of who you are. And this creates space. Space between stimulus and response. Space between feeling and action. Space where choice becomes possible. This is the space where balance lives. Not the balance of equal parts, but the balance of perspective, the ability to see yourself clearly without judgment, to hold your own experience with compassion and curiosity rather than criticism. And this balance does not come from effort. It comes from presence. It comes from spending time with yourself, in silence, without agenda, without trying to fix or improve or become. It comes from simply being and discovering that being is enough. You also begin to notice that the quality of your relationships changes, because you are no longer desperate for connection, no longer using others to fill a void inside you. You can meet them more fully. You can listen without needing to respond. You can be present without needing to perform. You can love without needing to possess. And this changes everything. Your relationships become more honest, more spacious, more real, because you are bringing your whole self, not just the parts you think are acceptable, not just the persona, but the deeper self that has been cultivated in solitude. The fifth sign is this: you stop comparing yourself to others. This is one of the most liberating shifts, and it often happens so quietly that you do not notice it until it is already well underway. You are scrolling through social media, and you see someone's achievement, someone's success, someone's perfect life, and instead of feeling the familiar pang of inadequacy, instead of immediately measuring yourself against them, you simply feel nothing. Or you feel something softer, something like appreciation or curiosity, but not envy, not the sense that their gain is your loss. You have stopped playing the comparison game because you have begun to understand deeply that your path is your own, that it cannot be measured against anyone else's, that there is no race, no competition, no standard you're failing to meet. This shift is profound because comparison is one of the primary ways we lose ourselves. We are constantly looking outside to see how we're doing, to see if we are enough, to see if we are ahead or behind. And this looking outside pulls us away from our own center, from our own knowing, from our own unique unfolding. It keeps us in a state of perpetual anxiety, always measuring, always adjusting, always trying to catch up to some imaginary standard that we can never quite reach. And the exhaustion of this is immense. But then, at some point, you stop. Not because you have achieved everything you wanted, not because you have finally become successful enough to stop worrying, but because you have realized that the entire framework of comparison is a trap. It is based on the false assumption that there is one right way to live, one correct timeline, one definition of success. And once you see through that assumption, once you realize that your life is not a race and other people are not your competitors, the whole structure collapses. And what remains is a kind of spaciousness, a kind of freedom, where you can simply be where you are without needing it to be anywhere else. You begin to notice this in small ways. You see a friend get a promotion, and instead of feeling threatened, you feel genuinely happy for them. You see someone achieve something you once wanted, and instead of feeling like you have failed, you feel curious about your own path, about what you actually want now, not what you thought you should want. You stop measuring your worth by external markers, by achievements and accolades and milestones, and you start measuring it by something else, something harder to define, but more real. You start measuring it by how aligned you feel, how present, how true to yourself. Jung would say that this is the movement from the ego to the self. The ego is always comparing, always competing, always trying to establish its place in the hierarchy. But the self does not compete. The self does not need to prove its worth because it knows, at a level deeper than thought, that worth is inherent, that it does not need to be earned or demonstrated. The self simply is. And as you begin to touch that place, as you begin to live from that deeper center, the need to compare falls away. You realize that you're not in competition with anyone, that there is enough, that your success does not diminish anyone else's, that your failure does not elevate anyone else's. This does not mean you stop striving or stop wanting things. It means you stop using other people as the measure of your own progress. You stop looking outside for validation of your choices. You stop trying to keep up with anyone. You move at your own pace, in your own direction, guided by your own inner compass. And this brings a kind of peace that is hard to describe. It is the peace of knowing that you are exactly where you need to be, even if it does not look like where anyone else is, even if it does not fit any external definition of success. You also begin to notice that when you stop comparing, you start seeing people more clearly. You are no longer projecting your own insecurities onto them, no longer using them as mirrors for your own inadequacy. You can appreciate their gifts without feeling diminished by them. You can celebrate their success without feeling like it takes anything away from you. And this opens up a kind of generosity, a kind of spaciousness in your relationships, where you're no longer competing for limited resources, where you can genuinely support each other because you understand that we are all on our own unique paths and there is no one right way. This is balance, not the balance of being equal to others, but the balance of being at peace with your own unfolding, of trusting that your life is happening exactly as it needs to, that there is no behind or ahead, only here, only now, only this moment and what it is asking of you. And when you stop comparing, you can finally hear what it is asking. You can finally see your own path clearly, without the distortion of constantly looking sideways to see how you measure up. The sixth sign is this: you become deeply aware of your own patterns, and instead of judging them, You begin to witness them with curiosity. You notice the ways you repeat the same conflicts, the same dynamics, the same emotional loops. You notice the way you shut down in certain situations, the way you become defensive or withdrawn or overly accommodating. And instead of berating yourself, instead of trying to force yourself to change, you simply watch. You become curious. You ask, where did this come from? What is this trying to protect me from? What old wound is this pattern trying to prevent from being touched again? This is the beginning of real transformation. Not the transformation that comes from willpower or self-improvement, but the transformation that comes from understanding. Jung said that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. He meant that healing does not come from transcending our shadow, our wounds, our patterns, but from turning toward them, from bringing them into the light of awareness, from seeing them clearly without judgment. And when we do this, something shifts. The pattern does not necessarily disappear, but it loses its grip. It becomes something we can see rather than something we are. You begin to notice this in your relationships. You see yourself doing the thing you always do, the thing you have done 100 times before, and instead of being swept away by it, you pause. You feel the impulse, the familiar pull, and you do not act on it immediately. You create space. You ask yourself, do I really want to do this? Is this serving me? Is this true? Or is this just old programming? And sometimes you still do the thing, but sometimes you do not. And the fact that there is a choice, the fact that you are no longer on autopilot, changes everything. This awareness does not come from trying to be more mindful or more conscious. It comes from spending time with yourself, from sitting in the discomfort of your own patterns without immediately trying to fix them. It comes from therapy, from journaling, from long walks where you let your mind wander and notice where it goes. It comes from the willingness to see yourself clearly, even the parts you do not like, even the parts you have spent years trying to hide or deny. And this willingness is an act of love. It is the willingness to meet yourself as you are, not as you wish you were, not as you think you should be, but as you actually are, in all your complexity and contradiction. Jung called this shadow work, the process of integrating the parts of ourselves that we have disowned, the parts that do not fit into our self-image, the parts we have projected onto others or buried deep inside. And shadow work is not comfortable. It requires us to confront the ways we have hurt others, the ways we have betrayed ourselves, the ways we have been complicit in our own suffering. But it is necessary, because we cannot become whole while still disowning parts of ourselves. We cannot find balance while still at war with our own nature. And what you discover as you do this work is that the patterns are not enemies. They are not flaws to be eradicated. They are adaptations, strategies you developed long ago to survive, to cope, to protect yourself from pain. And they served you well for a time, but now they may no longer be necessary. Now, you are strong enough to face what you once could not face. You are safe enough to feel what you once could not feel. And so the patterns can begin to soften, to release, to transform into something more flexible, more responsive, more aligned with who you are now rather than who you were then. This is not a quick process. It takes time. It takes patience. It takes the willingness to return to the same patterns again and again, each time with a little more awareness, a little more compassion, a little more space. But as you do this, you begin to feel something shift. You begin to feel less reactive, less defended, less at the mercy of your own unconscious impulses. You begin to feel more present, more grounded, more able to choose your responses rather than being driven by old programming. And this is balance, not the balance of perfection, but the balance of awareness, the ability to see yourself clearly and to hold yourself with compassion even when you fall short. The seventh sign is this: you begin to trust the timing of your life. You stop fighting against where you are. You stop wishing you were further along, more healed, more successful, more together. You begin to sense, in a way that is hard to articulate, that everything is unfolding exactly as it needs to, that there is a rhythm to your life that is not dictated by external timelines or social expectations, that your soul has its own schedule and it cannot be rushed. You begin to trust that the delays, the detours, the dark seasons were not mistakes. They were preparation. They were the slow, invisible work of becoming. This trust does not come easily. It comes after you have tried to force things and failed. It comes after you have pushed and strived and exhausted yourself trying to make things happen on your timeline, only to discover that life has its own ideas. It comes after you have surrendered, not in defeat, but in recognition that you're not in control, that there is a larger intelligence at work, that your job is not to force the river, but to learn how to navigate it. And when you finally stop fighting, when you finally let go of the need to control the outcome, something inside you relaxes. You begin to trust, not because you have proof, not because you can see the whole path, but because you have learned through lived experience that things have a way of working out, not always in the way you expected, but in the way that was needed. You begin to notice this in the way you relate to waiting. In the past, waiting felt like torture. It felt like being stuck, like wasting time, like falling behind. But now, you begin to see waiting differently. You begin to see it as a kind of gestation, a time when things are happening beneath the surface, things that cannot be rushed, things that need darkness and silence and time to take shape. You begin to trust that just because you cannot see progress does not mean there is no progress. You begin to trust that the invisible work is just as important as the visible work, maybe more important. Jung spoke of this as kairos, the right time, as opposed to chronos, clock time. He understood that the psyche does not operate on a linear schedule, that transformation cannot be forced or hurried, that it happens in its own time, according to its own logic. And the work of individuation is to learn to trust that timing, to stop trying to make things happen faster, to stop comparing your progress to anyone else's, to simply be present with where you are and trust that it is exactly where you need to be. This does not mean you become passive. It does not mean you stop setting goals or taking action. It means you stop forcing. You stop trying to make things happen through sheer will. You begin to sense when to move and when to wait, when to push and when to surrender. You develop a kind of inner knowing, a sense of rightness that is not based on logic or planning, but on something deeper, something more intuitive. And you begin to trust that knowing, even when it does not make sense, even when it goes against what everyone else is telling you to do. And as you learn to trust the timing of your life, something profound happens. You stop living in the future. You stop waiting for the day when you will finally be ready, finally be healed, finally be enough. You begin to inhabit the present moment, not because you have given up on the future, but because you realize that the present moment is all you have, that it is where life is actually happening, that the future you are waiting for will never arrive because it is always now. And in that realization, there's a kind of freedom, a kind of peace that does not depend on anything changing. You are here now, and that is enough. All of these signs, these 7 quiet shifts, are not separate. They are facets of the same process, the same deep transformation that happens when you stop trying to prove yourself, when you stop performing, when you stop fighting against your own nature. They are the signs that you are returning to balance, not the balance of having it all together, but the balance of being at peace with where you are, of trusting the process, of knowing that you are held by something larger than your own understanding. And this balance does not announce itself. It does not come with fanfare or revelation. It comes quietly, in the small moments, in the way you respond to a question, in the way you sit with uncertainty, in the way you feel when you are alone. It comes as a settling, a kind of inner exhale, a sense that you are no longer at war with yourself. And once you feel it, Once you recognize it, you realize that it was always there, beneath the noise, beneath the striving, beneath the need to prove. It was always there, waiting for you to stop long enough to notice. So what do you do with this recognition? How do you live from this place of balance? This place where nothing needs proving anymore? The answer is simpler than you might think. You do not need to do anything dramatic. You do not need to change your entire life or make grand declarations. You simply need to notice. Notice when you're performing and when you are present. Notice when you are seeking validation and when you are resting in your own knowing. Notice when you are comparing and when you are simply being. And in that noticing, you create space. Space for choice. Space for change. Space for the deeper self to emerge. You might also find it helpful to spend time in silence, not meditating in any formal way, but simply sitting, being, allowing whatever arises to arise without judgment. You might find it helpful to write, not to produce anything, not to be eloquent or insightful, but simply to let the words flow, to see what comes when you're not censoring, when you're not performing, when you're just letting the unconscious speak. You might find it helpful to walk, to move your body, to be in nature, to let the rhythm of your steps quiet the noise in your mind. These are not techniques. These are simply ways of being present, ways of creating space for the deeper process to unfold. And the more you practice this, the more you will notice the signs, the more you will recognize the quiet shifts that indicate balance is returning. You will begin to trust yourself. You will begin to trust the process. You will begin to trust that you are exactly where you need to be, that nothing is random, that every experience, every challenge, every moment of confusion or clarity is part of the larger pattern of your becoming. And in that trust, you will find a peace that does not depend on circumstances, a peace that is not contingent on having all figured out, a peace that simply is because you have stopped fighting, stopped proving, stopped performing, and you have come home to yourself. If this resonates with you, if you recognize these signs in your own life, I invite you to leave a comment below. Share your experience. Share what you are noticing. Share what is shifting. And if you found value in this exploration, if it helped you see something more clearly, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There is more to explore, more to uncover, more to recognize. And we are all in this together, all finding our way back to balance, back to wholeness, back to the quiet center that was always there, waiting,